But I wanted this morning to talk about a non-fiction book whilst it's still November, non-fiction November. Heidi from My Reading Life mentioned it. It's an American non-fiction, and it's by a female author called Roxane Gay, who has won awards for some of her fiction novels. But this is her story of her life, focusing particularly on her weight, because she's been overweight for all of her adult life. I really want to talk about some of the issues this book raised in me and made me think about, particularly in relation to the recent revelations we've had about Harvey Weinstein and the Me Too campaign, and I want to consider this novel in relation to shame and the impact of shame on ourselves, and the damaging impact of shame. But just briefly, what is Hunger about? And I think the beginning of chapter 5 in the book really sums up what this book is about. What you need to know is that my life is split in two, cleaved not so neatly. There is the before and the after. Before I gained weight, after I gained weight. Before I was raped, after I was raped. So as you can tell by that little section that I've read out, this is a book about how Roxane Gay understands her body in relation to being raped, gang raped, by a group of older boys when she was 12 years old. And she puts down her huge weight gain and her difficulties of losing weight down to the fact that this was a reaction to this rape, because this rape she hid from everybody. She hid it because of shame. And the boys who raped her, one of them was what she thought was her boyfriend. He was a young man who was about 5 years older than her, who had basically groomed her at the age of 12 to the point where she believed that she loved him, and she believed that what they were doing together was okay because he loved her back, and she allowed him to do things to her that made the gang rape much more inevitable, because he'd got her to the point where she didn't feel able to stop what was happening, and she felt too ashamed of herself to actually realise what had happened to her. She felt guilty. She felt responsible for what had happened. So she buried it, hid it, and at the age of 13 she then went off to boarding school. Her choice. She says she was kind of running away from what had happened, and this meant that she became sort of quite a stranger in terms of the distance from her family, and the longer she left it, the more she couldn't tell them. And she said over the years she wrote about it in her fiction. She even joined online forums to talk about what had happened to her, and she began to share what had happened to her with strangers, with readers, but she never fully told her family. And this book is her way of saying, I'm not hiding anymore. I'm coming out to say this happened to me, and this can explain to some degree my weight gain and the problems I have suffered as a result of my weight gain. But I'm no longer going to hide it. I'm no longer going to be ashamed. And as a result, she says she's not a broken person. She's someone that is now healing and is in a much better place. So it's a hopeful novel. It's a hopeful book. But I think lots of people will recognise some of the issues that she raises about body image, about how we see fat people, about the way we shame fat people in terms of our attitudes to them, how we don't have, for example, in planes they don't have seats big enough for fatter people. They would have to buy 2 seats. In restaurants and other places we don't make allowances for people who are large, and that basically makes them feel ashamed and makes them feel they can't join in with the rest of society. So Hunger's sort of a book that is in this kind of atmosphere at the moment, of where women and men, but women in particular, are feeling like finally they are being heard. Finally they feel they can say the things that they've kept secret. Finally people are taking notice and saying, no, that's not acceptable. So this book is for me, I read at quite an interesting time. Another thing that really came out was this sense that she wasn't able to say no. And she says it a number of times in the book. She says, I didn't know how to say no. My no did not matter. I fell further from the possibility of the word no. So there's this underlying narrative that as a young girl growing up, she didn't have the right to say no. And that might partly come from the cultural background that she was from. So she talked about her Haitian daughter being a good girl, a respectful, studious, hard-working, good girl. And immediately she began to be groomed by this young man. The more she felt like she wasn't a good girl, the more she felt like she was the opposite of what her parents expected of her. And I'm just guessing here, because she never says anything negative about her parents, but I'm just kind of guessing that her parents are maybe the sort of authoritarian parents who don't necessarily expect their children to make decisions for themselves. They expect their children to do as they're told because the elders know better. And I think there was quite a lot of pressure on herself and her siblings to do well at school, to do well in life and to be successful and to make her parents proud. And I guess this whole idea of not being able to say no probably originates within the dynamic between the parents and the child. And this is what I wanted to talk about first. Is there's been quite a lot of talk recently on the radio and the press about the fact that young children have the right to say no to being tickled or to being cuddled. And I was listening into a phone-in where people ring up and saying, this is utterly ridiculous. Young children love being tickled. This is the PC brigade gone too far. You know, if children can say, don't tickle me, and the adult can't tickle them, then this is ridiculous. Of course young children like to be tickled. And there was lots of this idea that this is absolutely stupid and we don't need to teach children not to be tickled, and there's nothing wrong with tickling behaviour. I think those callers are missing the wider point, which is we don't often give younger children agency over their own bodies. If you think about when you were younger, or maybe you've got young children yourself, and you think about when Granny comes over, and when Granny arrives, what do we often say to our children? What was often said to you is, give your Granny a kiss, or give your Grandad a kiss. And then there's this huge pressure on this child, whether they want to or not, to have physical contact with that adult. Now, if we then assume that children have no agencies over their bodies in terms of we can decide who touches them and who doesn't touch them, we can decide who they kiss or they don't kiss, is it any wonder they will then struggle, particularly as young teenagers, to be able to say, no, you can't touch my body. No, you can't do that to me. So one of the real things that came out for me from this book is that there's a lot more we need to do to educate parents about the rights of their children to consent to whether their body is touched or not. And so that means not saying to your child when grandma visits, go on, give your grandma a kiss, and then pushing them into that situation. That means allowing your children to decide for themselves. If grandma arrives and they don't go up for a hug, that's entirely your child's business. That has nothing to do with you. The same as, other members of the family. We should never force a child into a physical situation. So again, the idea of grabbing hold of your child and not letting them go, even if they're wiggling to get out, even if they're saying stop, we need to respect their ability to say no. So there's nothing wrong with tickling your children and playing tickling games or playing rough games with your children. But if the child says stop, I don't want it, or I don't want to play, overriding that and saying of course you do and grabbing hold of them is completely wrong. And I think if we start there with young children having the right to say no and the right to give consent or not to their bodies being touched, then that's going to make things so much easier for them when they get older. And it's not just girls, it's young boys as well. A whole lot of recent stuff has come out about Kevin Spacey and young men. We need to make sure that all children know and have rights to their own body. And we need to make sure that we give good sex education in primary schools. Now, that does not mean teaching children necessarily about having adult sexual relationships, but it does mean teaching children from a young age about consent, about private parts of our bodies, areas that we do tend to touch in social situations, i.e. the area kind of here. We might touch each other on our hands or even up to our shoulder, and areas that we don't expect to be touched. And we need to make sure that children are aware that there is no shame in their bodies. They shouldn't be ashamed of their bodies. But if someone touches their bodies in a way that makes them feel ashamed or makes them feel worried, then they need to tell us about it. So again, I get very cross when I hear adults saying young children don't need sex education. They do. I think one of the big problems for Roxane Gay was she probably didn't get that type of sex education. She didn't even understand what grooming was. She didn't know she was being groomed because it's unlikely she got good sex education at school. So what happened in the end was she felt like it was her fault that she'd let this boy go as far as he did. And because this good boy had gone as far as he did, she then felt like it was her fault that she was then raped by a group of boys. So she carried all that shame and guilt with her through her adult life. And then we need to get rid of shaming young people. We need to get rid of using shaming words like slut. One of the things that Roxane Gay talks about is after this gang rape event, the boys went back to school and told everyone about it. And everyone's reaction was that Roxane was a slut, rather than she's been raped. We're talking about a 12-year-old girl here who was made to feel like a slut because those who had more potential social power in her school, who were white, who were middle class, were able to set the tone of what had occurred. And instead of people recognising that here is a 12-year-old girl that's been traumatised, instead she was labelled and name-called, and that just appalls me. So I think hunger is really, really important as a message to say, in order to avoid this situation happening, or at least to deal with it effectively, we need to teach children about consent and about the rights to their own body. Having said that, I've talked briefly about guilt and shame. And why I absolutely applaud the Me Too campaign in terms of women coming out and saying, you're not on your own, this has happened to me, I really don't agree with the naming of the perpetrators. I think while it's absolutely really great solidarity that women are coming out and supporting each other, what I'm finding really difficult is the naming of that, because shame is a terrible, terrible emotion. Shame drives so many mental health problems and aggression problems. And I think by publicly naming somebody, we're not helping that person by naming them. We are giving them a huge amount of shame, and that might lead them to reject what we're saying. That might lead them to defend their position. That might lead them to, in some situations, take their own lives. It certainly won't improve their mental health. And I know people are saying, why are women only beginning to talk about it now? Well, the reason they're only beginning to talk about it now is if they'd tried to talk about it before, they would have been dismissed or shut down or called a slut. And it's just because the climate has changed that women can talk about it. So I'm really pleased about that. But what I really, really, really wish women would stop doing is naming people. I mean, it's wrong to do that. It's wrong to name somebody when actually, because it's basically trial by social media, isn't it? You need to go and seek advice, seek legal advice, and where appropriate, report the incident to the police. So that's my kind of discussion around Hunger by Roxane Gay. So I found it quite a troubling novel to read. I found it quite a difficult novel to read. I even got quite angry at her at times for not talking out about what happened to her, for not telling her parents what happened. I went through a period of thinking her parents can't have been very great people for them to not have noticed that this had happened to her. But she says they did notice, they just didn't know what was wrong. And she was very good at hiding. And I do believe her parents, I am sure, had her best interests at heart and loved her dearly. I guess they just came from a generation and a culture where children weren't necessarily given a voice in the same way as maybe some children are today. It was a really interesting read. I think some of the things I haven't touched on is how fat people are treated in society, and I guess I am guilty of some of the things that she talks about, of not really thinking about when I invite friends out, not really thinking about if I've got larger friends, whether that's going to be an issue for them in terms of where I've invited them. Are there lots of stairs, for example? Are the chairs got arms on them? It's really made me much more aware of how difficult the world can be for people who are overweight, because we have not accommodated for them. You know, it's something that I'm going to think about much more carefully now, and try really hard to make sure that I'm not being discriminatory. that kind of went off a bit, all that discussion, didn't it? But I kind of hope you get the point of what I'm trying to say about rights to our bodies and the way we bring up children, and trying to reduce feelings of shame by being the more open we are, the more we talk about these things, the less shame people feel. And that's really, really important, because shame is the thing that causes the damage. Thanks for listening to this. I hope it kind of makes some sense to you, and please do come back with comments below. Bye bye.